Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Jesus tells us that when the church is one, as he and the Father are one in John 17:21, that it's evangelistic. People will know God sent his son. He tells us in Matthew 5:16 that when the people of God are doing good works, the world sees it and the world praises God. So also evangelistic. So our focus on our podcast is around issues of unity, doing good works, justice, evangelism, sharing Jesus, and the equiper of that, making disciples. And we'll probably hit on every one of those as we talk today. With our good friend, Ben Feldott is with us. Ben is the senior pastor at Cape Cod Church. He planted Cape Cod Church with his wife, Tammy, back in 1992, in East Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is just over the bridge on the Cape. Ben, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, Charles, it's great to be with you. And as you know, we're fans of the work Vision New England is doing, and just really grateful for your leadership and partnership, and glad to be here today.
Thanks, and I'm grateful to you, as I think you know. But let's set a little bit of the stage, Ben. So you actually started preaching as a kid, I remember you telling me one time. Can you kind of help us go from preaching as a kid to a call to preach or to be a pastor, and then getting to Cape Cod?
Yeah. So, I grew up in great church out in Western Massachusetts. I lived in Springfield growing up, and went to church in Chicopee. It was called Tabernacle Baptist back then. That was when we had names like Tabernacle and Temple. We all figured out how to change those later on. Now it's called Life Point. My parents still go to that church, and my best friend from high school is now the pastor of that church. So we were in youth group, and I just had a youth director who really was a gift, and it's still there to this day. He's not the youth director anymore, but he's still on staff. And so I had some early on opportunities through like teen involvement programs. And then, notably our youth group went down to the Springfield Rescue Mission. Once a month, we'd go down and we'd lead a service. And this in the old days at a rescue mission in downtown Springfield. But the way it would work was before you had dinner, they would open it up. Anybody from the streets could come in for dinner. There was a residential piece, and then there was an open dinner. But everybody had to go to chapel first. So you had this kind of captive audience and different churches and groups that come in and sponsor. And our youth group went in about once a month for a season. And to begin with, we would go in and we'd go with our youth pastor, and he would promise to take us out for McDonald's or something after. I don't remember exactly, but he got us to go along. And my friend Kevin and I, who's now the pastor at that church, would go along. And then eventually he had us start doing the service. So one of us would preach and the other would lead music. And then the next month we would swap. And those are some of my earliest memories of preaching. And I think I probably discovered then in high school that I had the gift of gab, right? I like to talk, and at the same time, I really loved the church and the work of the church. The youth group was a central part of my life, and I think you put those two things together, and you started to see maybe God was doing the beginning of a call. The Bible says if a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good thing, and I think God put that desire in my life, and that was probably where it started, and led me going off to Bible college. So that's how it got started for me.
And so you sense that call. You wind up at Bible college, where a spoiler alert, you meet your wife.
That's right. And, best part.
And how does that lead to the Cape?
Yeah. So I went to a little Bible college in Boston. It's still there. It's called Boston Baptist College now. And my roots are Baptist. Our church is more non-denominational, but our roots are certainly Baptist. And I graduated from there, met Tammy. She was a school teacher for a bit. And I actually went to work for the college. and just started praying, God, what would you have us to do? And, I don't want to belabor this story a whole lot, but I was like, Lord, I'll do whatever you want. I was working for the college as kind of a recruiter, and I knew that wasn't a long-lived gig. And so I was kind of waiting, but you know what they say, if the phone's not ringing, you'll know it's for you. And nobody was calling. And I had got some guys, man, I'd love to go to work for that pastor or that pastor. And, Lord, I'll be a youth director. I'll be a missionary to an English-speaking country. I had all these kind of fleeces that I put out. And, but the one thing I said, I had never started a church. I was not the least bit interested in starting a church. And I knew some guys that had, and everyone I knew, every time I went and visited one of these church plants, and now this is back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was depressing. I mean, it was just like, and it was as hard as you would actually imagine. It was like, how do you get that initial group of people? And I actually think over the last 20 years, groups have come up with really good strategies around how to do this, which has made it somewhat more tenable. But faithfully, somebody said to me, "Hey, you should listen to these tapes," and they gave me 13 cassette tapes, which they were by a guy I'd never heard of, but they were all on building a church that reached people who didn't go to church. And Tammy and I were on a spring break, spring break, going down to Pennsylvania. We listened to these cassette tapes, and honestly, by the time we got done listening to these, I'd grown up in a fundamentalist environment, and it was so different. This approach to reaching people who didn't go to church was so different that by the time we got done with that trip, the only thing in life we wanted to do was go start a church. And those tapes, actually, the guy became famous. His name is Rick Warren. Those tapes would later on become the Purpose-Driven Church. And then, of course, the Purpose-Driven Life would make him famous all over the world. But that was sort of how we got going. And then we just started praying about towns. And we were living in South Shore area. We were living in the town of Norton. And we just started looking around geographically. We looked at the town of Easton, we looked at the town of Plymouth, and I had a friend who was on the Cape who said, "Hey, have you ever thought about coming to the Cape?" And honestly, I was a kid from Springfield. I didn't know anybody who vacationed on the Cape, right? That was the other side of the tracks, the good side of the tracks. And my wife had some familiarity with the Cape, and so we came down and took a look. And honestly, I'm going to give you the least spiritual thing, but it's the true story. We narrowed it down to two towns. It was the town of Easton and the town of Falmouth. And a friend gave me, I said, I can't make a decision. I said, these towns, there's a lot, they're somewhat similar demographically, and they're quite different, but they size-wise. And that friend said, he said, why don't you pick the town where you wouldn't mind spending the rest of your life? That turned out to be really good advice, right? Because who knew we were going to be here the rest of our lives? I think too, part of it was that we were in a church, and when we were in Easton, we were in a church close by, and that church started going through a season of division, and people were leaving. And it coincided with us going and starting a church, and people actually wanted us. They wanted us to go the next town over because they would be our group. And there were a lot of our friends, right? And we actually took that as a sign that God wanted us to go somewhere else. Like, we had just enough sense. We were 23 years old, right? We had just enough sense to know, you probably don't want to start a church with a group of people who the only thing they really have in common is they're mad at the last church, and that's why they're at your church. Right. And so God used that confluence of things to bring us to Cape Cod, and the rest, as they say, is history.
I always love how God works with those stories of, it just so happened this guy gave you some tapes. It just so happened it was Rick Warren. It just so happened you listened to them, right? At some point, I don't care what your theology is, at some point, there's too many just so happens.
That's right.
And so you guys settled on the Cape in 92.
Yeah.
So what's happened family-wise and church-wise since then?
Yeah. So we settled in 92. We've been married 9 months when we got here. I don't, we were 23 years old. I don't recommend anybody going out and starting a church at 23. I've got a daughter who is now, who's 26 going on 27, and you know her. And honestly, she is more mature than either of us were going into that. And I still look and go, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? It was, And I think in some ways, we spent 5 years in what we call the plumbing building. So we had a rented building, and honestly, it was very small. Like for those 5 years, we maybe grew to an average of like 30, 35 people, right? So it was a very small church. I think in some ways that was God's kind of grad school for me. Like, listen, I'm going to protect you. I'm not going to send too many people, right? Like, I'm going to keep you sort of anonymous, and I'm going to let you grow into this thing. And so we spent 5 years in that building. And then we bought our first piece of property. That may be the greatest miracle of all. 30, 35 people. We bought right before the economics of Cape Cod took off. So we bought this piece of property. We were able to build this little building that seated like 80 people. And, we're 5 years into it. And we move into this building, and, I don't know, it might have cost us $200,000 for everything. And it had a parsonage in this building. I mean, looking back, it's like, what were you doing? And we had never built anything in our life. Like, we had no building experience, but I was the gift of gab. I was good at talking people into stuff. So every friend I had ever made, I talked into doing something to help us build that first building. And then when we moved into that building, we kind of went through about, I would call it a 15-year season of just consistent growth. We just started growing. I mean, visitors started coming. We were ready for it. We started reaching our community. And I think we were becoming what Cape Cod Church will become. I think God spent 5 years getting me ready, and then 15 years getting our church ready. And then about 9 years ago, give or take, we went through a major relocation to where we are now, which is what most people know of Cape Cod Church is, we built a large facility. The church went through an exponential season of growth where we grew to over 1,000 people, which for Cape Cod is pretty large because it's not a demographically dense population, but it's a unique place, and God's given us some really unique opportunities in that. So along that way, Tammy and I had 4 kids. I've got 3 daughters and a son. My oldest is 26, who you know pretty well. And then I've got a 24-year-old who lives in New York City, works as a marketing director. A 20-year-old, this is all making me feel very old, Charles, right? Who's a sophomore at Boston College. And then a 16-year-old who's a junior in high school. So I'm still feeling pretty young, even though I've been at Cape Cod Church almost 30 years, because I still have kids in school, and I'm still doing the drop them off at school, run to a sports game after school stuff, which I absolutely love. And kind of on the family front, as you may know, my oldest daughter was in her senior year. She was an economics major at Georgetown, and came to me and said, actually, Dad, I think God is calling me into ministry. And I think the first thing I said is, are you prepared for the cut in pay you just took? Because the economics majors were all going to work for the hedge funds. And I'm like, well, and honestly, it's been one of the great joys of my life. She went off to divinity school, but we get to work together now, which has just been a great joy. So that's my story.
And your daughter that's from New York City, is she back? Or because I know you had a whole load of people living with you through COVID for a while.
Yeah, no, my daughter Brianna was in New York City, came back, was working remotely, but is back in the city now. Really just loves New York City, wanted to be there. I think she's still working remotely. Her offices are at Times Square. So I'm like, they're never going to open those offices, but she loves the city life, as I think a lot of the young folk. See, young folk, that was an old people term right there. My kids would be shaking their head.
I noticed that being so young myself, right, that I identify with them. And so based on that story, you guys must be pretty good at evangelism. Is that a fair assessment? And how do you equip or challenge? What would you attribute that to?
Yeah. So, yeah, not necessarily, right? Like I think you would say, oh, it's a big church, right? They must be good at evangelism. And I don't think that's actually necessarily true. I think churches can actually grow pretty large by the show, right? They can, and I don't even mean show in a negative way. Like they can have real excellence in programming, they can have excellence in preaching and in music. And if once they get a little bit of momentum going, that can kind of self-perpetuate, and they can grow through attracting people from other churches. And I think you have to be really intentional about growing through evangelism. I hope we are good at that, right? There's certainly no doubt that, we have some of what you would call that excellence in programming, and we do see people who are already Christians come to our church, but we measure it. So it matters to us. We have always intentionally said we want to be a church that reaches people in church. So we have an exit survey we ask of every visitor so that we can measure. And from year to year, that percentage fluctuates, but it's usually between 49 and 58% of all of our visitors tell us they were unchurched before they came to visit Cape Cod Church. Now, usually what that means is they may have grown up in church. They were 13. They got their get out of jail free card. They stopped going. Now they're in their mid 30s, 40s, and their own kids are asking questions about God. So they decide it's time to jump back into it. And we meet them, and we often meet them at the place where they've got questions about their faith. So I would say, I think we're pretty good at that. And I think there are probably a couple of things that help churches to be places that reach people who are lost, who are unchurched, who are searching. I think the first thing is we've tried to create a culture where people are welcome, right? And I think every church wants to think that they're a welcoming, friendly church. Rick Warren had a great statement years ago. He said, we want to be a church where people, let me think if I can remember, where people are welcomed and wanted without being watched. I think that's the most New England statement ever, right? Like people, visitors, they want to feel welcomed and wanted, but give me my space. Like, okay, that's far enough. Like, don't bring cookies to my house on Monday because I visited you, right? Don't call me. Like, keep an appropriate distance. And so I think that appropriate distance is how we allow people to come and explore at their own pace. So I think sometimes in church, we can be overly friendly, and it scares people because they think we're up to something there's an ulterior motive. You only want something that bad so you have to tone that down. And then I think not setting time frames on people, right? Like expectations, like, oh, you've been coming here for 6 months and we should have this Bible language down, what's the Spirit saying to you and things like that, right? People so allowing people to come at their own pace. And I think one of the ways we do that, and we try and intentionally do that, is by acknowledging their presence in the room with our language. So when we're speaking from the stage, when we're opening our Bibles, when we're saying something, a lot of times without knowing it, pastors, church leaders, people from the stage use language that assumes everybody is on the same page. Turn in your Bibles to, the book of Leviticus, on Paul's second missionary journey, and I'm teaching on Paul right now. And, we make assumptions about what people know without explaining it. And that's insider language. So if every once in a while we're very quiet, say, listen, you may not believe this, you may be on the journey and you haven't accepted this fact, but this piece of the story, this is what the author's coming. So I think we try and occasionally use language like that so that the people out there know, hey, this is not all people who've bought in. This is an environment where people come from a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives. So does that kind of go to it a little bit?
So nothing's wrong with words like sanctification, justification, or something, but they create a barrier to the skeptic who may not be unchurched.
Yeah, therein lies the rub, right? This is why people often create the false dichotomy between churches for mature believers and churches that reach people. I mean, this is like the worst thing ever, right? And I think it's, churches that seem highly evangelistic and churches that are highly discipleship driven, right? Like we should be able to pick between these. There's a horrible dichotomy, but we feel that tension, like, oh, I can't use those words because people won't understand them. But you can use those words if you explain them in ways that everybody, and not making the assumption, and sometimes when we explain things like, oh, am I dumbing it down? No. Like we probably all need justification and sanctification explained to us on at least a bi-monthly basis, right? So we don't get those things sort of confused. But I think when we say things, even when we say, like, listen, what Jesus is saying here is Jesus is claiming to be God in the flesh. Now, listen, you may be here and you may not believe that. You may have just said, whoa. I'm not sure I can buy into that yet. That's okay. That's okay. I just want you to know that's what Jesus is saying about himself, and it sets up what's coming next. So in that way, you're giving people permission to stay at a distance. And the unique thing is when you give people permission to stay at a distance, they're more willing to listen and they're more willing to make the journey with you. And I think what it does is it actually lets people get close enough that they wrestle with the one thing people have to wrestle with. And that is Jesus. Like, is Jesus who he said he was? And did he do what he said he was going to do, specifically rise from the grave? I think everything else, frankly, is details. Those things, like, I want to whittle it down to the thing. And honestly, people are going to wrestle with that. I was in a group, I'm in a book group with, I used to call it 9 atheists and a pastor, right? There was a bunch of atheists and agnostics, and it's a long story how I got involved in this, but it's been and the group's morphed over time. It's not exactly that makeup anymore. But we were in a discussion about faith. We were reading the book God Is Not One by Stephen Prothero. It's not a specifically religious book, but it covers the world religions. And one of the guys in the group asked me, he says, "Oh, let me," he said, "I just want to make sure I'm straight." And we were actually doing this conversation at our church. He said, "Do you believe in God?" I thought, like, who asked the pastor that question? Like, I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, because my rabbi does it. I'm like, whoa, okay, that was a whole new education. And I said, yeah, I do. I said, in fact, let me put all the cards on the table. I believe that Jesus was God in the flesh. Like, and I think that all of this other stuff is actually, like, what about creation and evolution? What about the miracles of the Bible? I said, I think the real question is, did Jesus rise from the grave? Like, because that's the crux of the issue. And when you answer that, well, if that's true, everything else is details.
Right. And you can work your way into everything else once that's true, right?
And that's exactly right. And a lot of times people are caught up on the periphery stuff that they want to fight about, right? They want to fight about it because it matters to them. Well, what does the church think about, sexuality? And what does the church think about government? And what do you think about Trump? And, what about evolution, right? And like all of these things that sit out there. And it's not that we're afraid to touch on those issues. I just don't think they're the issues that matter the most. I think the issue that matters the most is the resurrection of Jesus. So,
I think it was C.S. Lewis who kind of pinned it as the key question is, who was Jesus?
Yeah.
And where you land on that drives everything else, which is your point. I've talked to so many pastors who are making the same point you are, where we assume some level of biblical knowledge. And that's just not in our culture anymore. And so I remember one pastor saying, right, I had somebody ask me who Abraham was. Now, if you grew up churched, how could anybody not know who Abraham was? Right. I had another pastor tell me somebody had been coming to his church for 3 or 4 weeks and came up to him afterwards and said, okay, now I've liked what I've been hearing, but now what is a Jesus? Right? And it's like, again, for our generation, everybody knows those things. Today's generation, there's so many people who don't know those fundamental things. So it's easier to create a barrier without even thinking you're creating a barrier for folks.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you can't explain it enough. But if you know they're in the room and you act like they're in the room, and now with so many of us being on the internet, right? It's easier than ever. Like, I have to assume there's somebody watching this that doesn't yet believe what I believe. And they may not have all the background knowledge. And so I'm only showing respect for them when I step back. And if there are Christians who go, oh, he's explaining who Jesus is, like, this is so something like I would actually push back against that person and say, that's a heart issue. Like you should recognize that there are people that are not like, and you should want their presence. Like if you assume that none of them are in your place and listening, well, isn't that a really scary thing to make the assumption? Well, everybody here knows. What is that saying about your evangelistic opportunities? Yeah.
No, I think we would see the same thing. I remember us having a conversation. I used to go to a larger church. I've been kind of small church, big church, medium church. And I remember we figured a third of the people coming to our church weren't believers.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit of science, but not a lot. It was a little bit more gut feel. And the answer was, and we're like, well, is that good? And the answer was, they come to us every week to let us tell them about Jesus. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, then you have the added thing, Charles. I think it was W.A. Criswell down at First Baptist in Dallas who famously said, I think half my congregation is unsaved. And he was speaking a different way. He said, they think they are.
Yeah.
That's a whole different kettle of fish we won't get into today.
Now, I do think about a part of your evangelism strategy, if we can call it that you haven't spoken about, and that's about what you do in your community.
Yeah.
And I think Thrive is something that plays in that. Can you talk a little bit about community and Thrive and how people in your community see you as a result of it?
Right. Yeah. So Thrive is something, and it's really where you and I got to meet, was at this idea that we kind of coalesced around, that was, Thrive is really a regional conference. It's hyper local, right? So for us, it's all of Cape Cod. It's gathering the church on Cape Cod together for the purpose of encouraging the church, of accelerating evangelism, but also of serving our community. So the centerpiece of Thrive is a day-long conference of breakouts around community events. And so we invite community partners in, and everything from feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, mental health initiatives, immigration issues. And so every year it's different. I think we probably have 12 to 16 breakout sessions. We bring in organizations and leaders from that. We have them present, and we have churches and people from churches actually just sit in, be inspired by what they're doing, ask questions, and explore how it is that you could be a part of what is happening in this region to address these issues. So this has been, there's a couple of things that happen there. Thrive is, I think, it's a gathering of specifically the evangelical church on Cape Cod. And we've gone to some pains to define what evangelical is, but it's the gathering of the church together around serving our community. I think that's powerful together because the Bible said, by your love one for another, the unity that we have will be assigned to the world. So I think that there's something about that, and something about serving our neighbor that is just, it's exactly what they're going to know you by your love. And what we've discovered is when we do that, it validates everything we say. Everything we say is just what we say until we validate it by the way we serve our neighbors. And all of these are ways and initiatives that we're serving our neighbors. And honestly, it's built on itself, right? It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The more we do, the more we want to do, the more opportunities come. Right after we do this interview, I've got a meeting with an organization that we actually met through Thrive. I didn't even know about them. We were at a Thrive gathering, and somebody said, oh, I'm involved in doing something with that, feeding kids who are hungry, who knew there was a hunger issue on Cape Cod. And we invited them. They came and presented. There's so many sessions. I don't get to go to all of them. I didn't go to this one. I knew almost nothing. 2 years later, I have a man in our church reach out to me and said, hey, I'd like to give to that organization. Could I do that through the church? I'm like, how do you know about them? He goes, oh, they were at Thrive. I'm like, what are they doing again? And he started telling me all about it. I'm like, that's a great organization. Why are we not more involved with them? And we ended up featuring them as one of our featured partners. It's actually an interesting group. It started out of a small church down Cape that's just doing fantastic work, and they're one of our growing partners. I think these are the things that validate the message, that what we're actually preaching, we believe and we act out. And where people might object to what we say, in these cases, I think they're more willing to listen because they see the evidence in our service. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was actually, I quoted Matthew 5:16 as we were starting. And the person who reminded me of that verse and put it on my radar screen was Johnny Erickson Tada, who did a video for us for Thrive last year.
Yeah.
Where she talked about, that when the people of God do good works, the world sees it and praises God, which goes right to when they'll know us by our love. And so suddenly people who object to the Christian message and to faith and to evangelicals even suddenly aren't so bothered by us when we're actually living that out. Is that what you say?
Yeah, it is. I want to add something about it. So we've been on this journey now, creating the Thrive Conference and trying to be a gathering point for the church. And by that, I don't mean we're not trying to be the big church or the leading church. We recognize that we have a position by virtue of the resources that God's given us and the size that we have, but we recognize that we're a part of the body, right? We're not the whole of the body. And some of this came because when we were going through this relocation, and God has blessed us along the way, one of the things we said to our church is that we want to be a part of changing the spiritual temperature on Cape Cod for the next 50 to 100 years, right? And for some reason, that just resonated in our community. Well, shortly after we moved in and we saw this explosive growth and we realized like, okay, God's given us a great opportunity, but still, the vast majority of believers on Cape Cod don't go to Cape Cod Church, right? 75% of them go to other churches. Evangelical church. I'm just talking about within the evangelical one, and I don't mean to assume that all the believers are in that, but that's the stream that we swim in.
And by evangelical, you and I mean a theological term, not a political term.
That's right. That's right. A theological term. Yeah, we would use Bebbington's quadrilateral. We won't go into all of that, but it's very broad definition of what it is. But so what I was going to say about that, Charles, I think is worth saying is that gathering the church together locally is hard. It's like really, really difficult. And I think it's difficult because churches tend to gather everywhere. Churches tend to gather together around affinity, right? So they gather, so we all go to the same conferences, but the conferences we go to are with churches like us. They have the same theology, they like the same music, they even dress the same way, right? There's like, oh, this is a suit and tie conference, and this is the Hawaiian shirt conference, and this is the fashionable ripped jeans conference, right? So there's like, we gather together around points of affinity, and if you're slightly charismatic, this will be the one you fit in over here, and if you're kind of a Reformed Southern Baptist, you'll fit in this one over here. And if you're, we could go on and on and on, right? But locally, what makes local difficult is that the only two things we have in common are geography and Jesus. But nobody wants to admit it. We feel like we're in competition with one another, right? And this makes getting together really, really hard. I think it takes humility on the part of the pastors. And one of the things we added in some years ago is that we would finish on the Friday night United Night of Worship with communion, and we would have all the pastors serve it. And it's quite a powerful scene, right? To see all of your pastors from all the different denominations and theological persuasions that kind of come together under this broad evangelical umbrella, and we're going to serve communion as one body, And then at the end of serving all the elements, the pastors come and stand together up front. And we have traditionally asked one of our elder statesmen, a retired pastor, to be the one. In fact, Ed Delacour has done it on a number of occasions, and Ed passed away just recently, and we're really grieving his loss. And Ed didn't pastor the largest church on the Cape, and he had been retired for many years, but we had a deep amount of respect for him. And so I thought it was a beautiful, symbol of this is the church body coming together. But don't underestimate how difficult this is. It's really, really challenging, but I think it's really, really important as well.
Yeah, I always remember, I think it was the first year we got together with the whole group of pastors, and Doug Scalisi, one of our partners in this, I remember him saying to everybody, "You are not my competition."
Yeah.
96 to 98% of people don't go to church every Sunday. You're not my competition. Yeah. Sunday morning sports are, apathy is, right? The Little League, right? Those are the store, work, right? Those are my competition, not you guys, right? And so I love the beauty of it, because you and I have talked about this before. So many ministry started, not you or Doug or some pastor starting it, but just somebody feels called and convicted by God, and they just start a ministry, or they plug into a ministry. And in some cases, you guys have swamped people with people volunteering for ministries. It's just amazing what happens when God's people starts talking about our problems in our communities, and then God uses that evangelistically.
100%. Yeah, we discovered that our people, listen, a church only needs so many people to serve in the church. How many people do you need to be greeters?
Yeah.
Right? You're never going to have enough Sunday school workers. We know that. That's not going to change. I can promise you, it doesn't matter how big you are, you're always going to need more Sunday school workers, right? Because it takes a certain special calling to do Sunday school, to work in the nursery. But you don't have, what we found is that when we brought in these organizations, so we started partnering, we started looking specifically for organizations in our community whose their mission aligned closely enough with us that we could support them financially and also support them with volunteers. So we funnel volunteers. We bring them in for our annual missions month. We present them on stage, and we say, hey, we want to partner in sending volunteers. So if you're here today and you want to serve, one of our partners, a group called Neighborhood Falmouth that serves seniors just by basically providing them rides. They increased their volunteers by 50% in one Sunday that they were here with us. And we were like, how great is this? We just got 60, 70 new people involved in ministry through our church. And I'm not managing any of the oversight of it, right? We're the connector, and our people see themselves serving in the community, and they're connecting that ride they're giving to that senior through Neighborhood Falmouth. They're connecting that to their worship of God himself. And we think that's really what he meant when he said, love your neighbor.
And there's an evangelistic opportunity in loving that senior when you're driving them, and in the organization saying, who are these people?
Yeah.
60 people. I remember when we were putting together the panel on human trafficking, there's a small anti-human trafficking group on the Cape that I ended up connected with, and I was trying to get somebody to come be on our panel. They ended up sending a law enforcement officer, and they're not a Christian ministry at all. But I remember the person who ran it sending me a thing saying, hey, is it okay if we come too? And like, so you're unsaved and you want to know if it's okay to come to church? Yeah, I think we're okay with that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And so, Ben, what's COVID done shortly? I don't want to spend too much time on COVID, but it's impossible to ignore.
Yeah. Oh, man. We could spend a lot of time on this for sure. Like for a lot of people, I think if your church was healthy going into this, you're probably pretty stable. If you were having some struggles to begin with, this has magnified them a little bit. So here's what I would say it's done for us is once you figured out you're going to survive, right? Like, oh, our expenses are down, our finances are stable. Well, then you have to decide, okay, what are we going to do with this opportunity? We're either just going to wait it out, or we're going to step into this as an opportunity. So we're looking at it as an opportunity to rebuild. And I think the best time to rebuild things is before they're in desperate need of being renovated, right? Before everything is dated and dead. And so we had been kind of in a season already. We had been a year. Now we had been about 6 months into the project. Now we've been about a year and a half into the project of just evaluating what is the next decade for Cape Cod Church going to look like, and how are we going to reach the next generation, specifically millennial generation and Gen Z. How are we going to reach them? We started some internal research called the Story Project around that. So here's how I would describe it. It's kind of like you had a fire and it burnt your house down, right? And not only to burn your house down, it burned down every house in the neighborhood. That's kind of what happened to churches last year, right? All of our programmings went up in smoke, right? Our buildings were left intact. It's like a neutron bomb. Like, it was all of our programming, all this stuff was like gone. You can't do children's ministry, you can't do youth ministry, you can't do, your small groups. Like, so then you go through it, and at first it's just like you're in shock. You're like, whoa, what am I going to do, right? But then on the other side of that, you realize, oh, okay, well, we survived. Like, everybody got out alive. We're grateful for that, right? So now you breathe a sigh of relief. And then now you're worried about, like, oh, do we have enough to rebuild? Like, are we going to make it, right? So if I could take the fire analogy, it's like you realized you were well insured. Like, okay, hey, we go, like, financially, we're not going to go under, because people are really, really nervous about, like, financially, are we going to go under? So now you realize, oh, we've got enough we can rebuild. So now what are you going to do? So this is where we're at. We're looking, going, okay, so we get to rebuild this thing. What are we going to do? Well, here's what we're going to do. This is what we've decided internally. We're not leaving the neighborhood. We're going to rebuild on the same foundation we built on before. Like that foundation was there, was a really good foundation. We're not changing everything, but we're going to get to but when we rebuild, like, wow, what would you, like, if you could rebuild everything, like you had the resources to do it and you got to start your house over. Here's my guess. You'd build something different than you built the first time, because your family has changed, right? Oh, we're going to build a new wing for the grandkids, right? And that's kind of what we're doing. We're like, oh, we want to make room for that next generation. So how would we rebuild? We got the same building, but we're going to rebuild programming. And how are we going to do that to reach that next generation? So we're looking at this as an opportunity for us to rebuild and reframe how it is that we do evangelism, discipleship, how it is we talk to the next generation. So that's where we're at. We're not there yet.
You said something, though, that was like, I think maybe like week 2 or 3 of COVID, right? We're moving up on our 1-year anniversary of the 2-week shutdown. But it was like 2 weeks into it, where you said in a couple of times in sermons, what will we look back on?
Yeah.
And be glad we did. So what do we have to do, right? You said it better than I just did, but and I shared that with so many people, and I still think that's a good way to look at this, is what do we want to look back and say, I'm glad we did this?
Yeah, we've all had regrets where we look back and we go, what was I thinking? I wish I hadn't said that, done that. Or I wish I would have taken advantage of that opportunity. I wish I would have bought Bitcoin last December, that kind of thing, right? So I just, at the very beginning of this, we just had a sense like, listen, we don't know all the answers, but I know this, like, you're going to look back in this season and go, well, this is going to be over at some point and it's going to change. And you're going to go, man, that was a great opportunity. What did I do with it? And so the one thing we said early on is we're going to lean into scarcity with generosity. I just think that generosity is always the answer to everything. I think generosity is the active form of love. So if you're not sure what to do, be generous. Just find a way to be generous. Like, hey, listen, this is a season, everything's blowing up. We don't know how we're going to have enough money. Okay, well, if 6 months from now you found out, oh, we had enough money to pay our bills, and oh, we had enough that we could have been generous. Well, it's too late, right? Live generously now. Like, live generously before you know you have it, and see what God does. You'll be living by faith, and I've always found that He'll bless that. Like, and that's what we've discovered, that you're not going to outgive Him, and we haven't been perfect about it. I think there's sometimes we're just so exhausted. You're like, oh gosh, what next? But
well, and not every church has financial wherewithal to do that. But you preached a series on generosity, and it's not just about money.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that I think really any church can, of any size, right? Once you step into this, right? Once you decide that's going to be our posture, we want to be a part of this, right? You can mobilize the church to serve outside of them. So like how can we partner and do this? And we invited other churches to join in with us in this, right? So that other church could say, hey, we gave $50 to the cause. They get to get up and announce it in the same fashion that we would. Hey, here's what we're doing to serve our community. And here's what I find. Your people in your church, they want you to be generous. They want to be a part of something that's generous. Everybody wants to be a part of something that's generous. They don't want to be a part of something that's foolish, but they sure as heck don't want to be a part of something that's known for being stingy. And when something is generous, it's like, oh, I want to be a part. I want to be associated with that. And I find that generosity begets generosity. Like when people see that, man, the cops, and that really is one of the things that we never actually raised money for any of the endeavors we were doing. But it ended up people just gave towards them in such great amounts that it funded all of it. Like, and we weren't even asking, but people, so they saw that, they're like, hey, can I give something to that? And oh, by the way, at the same time, it didn't diminish our regular giving. It wasn't like people say, oh, I'll just give over this. They gave and I don't want to make this all about finances because I think it's more than that. So.
So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to have a little bit of a theological conversation in this podcast. And so you've been ministering for 30 years. As you look back, what's an area where you would say theologically, I had that wrong, or I've evolved some, or I think about it differently today, knowing that if something's probably wrong if you haven't changed anything in your theology over 30 years, right? Because God grows us.
Yeah.
So what would you think about in that?
That's a really interesting point that you just made there. I hope people don't gloss over that. Something's probably evolved, like something's probably grown, unless you had perfect knowledge. I have a really good friend who serves on our board here, Dr. Yu, who said to me some years ago, we were talking about beliefs and convictions. He goes, Christianity. Dr. Yu is a professor at MIT. He's came here as a Chinese student who's just a wonderful guy and exudes humility. He says, Christianity is really an interesting thing. He says, we're supposed to believe things with such conviction that we'd be willing to die for them. And yet with such humility that we'll admit we're wrong on the next hand. Like, it's like these things, and I think that probably separates essentials from non-essentials. So I grew up in a fundamentalist environment. And honestly, I got some great gifts from that. And I got some heavy baggage, right? So I got a love for the Bible, a love for evangelism, a respect for the local church. I'm so grateful for those gifts, and they continue to serve me to this day. But I also grew up in a world where it was like our group was the only one, and our interpretation was the only interpretation, right? And I really believe that. Like I believe. It's embarrassing sometimes looking back at it, how narrow I painted, the Christian world. That like other evangelicals, like no, you believe that? That's not, and some of that was probably immature.
I was accepted in theory. I'm wrong about something in my theology, but practically I can't spot any of it.
Yeah. So I probably had a number of things. I mean, honestly, I grew up in a King James only environment. That was one of the first things that. I mean, it actually took me almost 9 years before because I had such a high respect for the Bible, and I still do, right? Before I kind of was able to see that position was not, that position was in error, and I needed to let go of it. I ultimately made some changes around how I viewed the story of origins in Genesis, and I recognized that I knew a lot of good people who believed in the beginning God created. And then they believed a whole bunch of different stuff than me after that, but both people had a deep commitment to Scripture. And then maybe women in ministry has been one of the most, in recent years, pivotal change. Women in leadership, women in speaking, women in preaching, women as pastors in the church. And we could certainly unpack that quite a bit. So where do you want me to go with that?
You tell me. Because we're not ready to do a Bible study lesson on it, right? Where you could go through each of the verses. But tell us enough that folks don't hear that as, well, you're just conforming to the culture.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I hope people recognize I've got a real high view of Scripture, right? And by that I mean everything's got to go back to the Bible. If it's not here, we don't just get to make this stuff up, right? We're working off of a script, and I'm not the author. I'm just the applier, right? Like figure out what it says here. But also the humility of listening and learning is a pretty important piece. The problem for most of us is when it comes to really deeply entrenched things, we're probably not very open to listening and learning. It's just hard for us, right? Like honestly, the King James thing, if I could use that as an analogy, I was like, no, I can't let go of this, right? I mean, I had really fervently in my teenage years, I had just grown up with it and so committed to it. And I felt like I was abandoning something that I wasn't supposed to abandon, when I started reading from another translation. So on the women in ministry thing, I think I'd always felt like as a church, we were missing a part of it by not having women's voices in leadership. So for many, many years, our board, which we call an executive team here, has featured women on it, going back, gosh, probably almost 20 years, right? So this has been a long-standing, thing for us. And then probably about 14, 15 years ago, I remember introducing the first time we had a woman as a worship leader, who was our main worship leader. And I remember that being somewhat controversial. And I was a little bit surprised by that, but it seemed like a natural evolution. We're playing and singing over here. We're going to move them from here to here. And so there was some natural evolution, but none of that really prepared me for when my oldest told me that she felt called into ministry. And honestly, I don't know if I've ever shared this before, but I remember her coming into my office to tell me this. And, she was her senior year of college and she was an econ major. She was going to switch she was a psych minor, but she was going to flip that because she felt like it might serve the ministry better to have a psych major and an econ minor. And I remember she was nervous about telling me. How sad is that? Your kid loves Jesus so much that they want to give their life towards serving, and they're nervous about telling you. And I was blind to it. I'm like, well, why? What are you nervous about? And I don't think she wanted to tell me because I think she was like, oh, I might want to do something you don't think I can do, Dad, is what she was saying. And I said, listen, we're going to walk this journey together. We're going to figure this out together. And I'm going to love you no matter what. None of that matters. But here's what I tell people. My daughter's calling forced me to look closely at what Scripture said. But it was Scripture that convinced me. Ultimately, I had to be convinced at what I saw in Scripture. And when I went back and looked at Scripture, and I'll give the long version short. When I look back in Scripture and I looked at those two passages that say, "Suffer not a woman to speak," I'm converting to King James English there, and you've got two passages, Corinthians and Timothy, that speak to that. I then had to weigh those against all the passages that I had just glossed over that clearly showed women speaking with authority in the church. I mean, the Bible says he gave us first apostles, then prophets, and pastors and teachers. First apostles, then prophets. Well, in Acts 2, it says that, he said the power of the church, the evidence that the Holy Spirit is empowering the church will be that your sons and daughters prophesy. And you see it repeated that women in the early church were speaking prophetic, speaking with authority, bold proclamation of the truth of God. And this was a sign that God was doing something in the church. And honestly, we didn't rush into this as a church. I didn't rush into it as an individual. We just kind of let's watch where God is leading this. And I think for us, part of it was too that when Britt began to speak in little pieces here and there, if I could, I think that the Holy Spirit gave witness to the fact that God's hand was on her. I didn't have to do that. our church could see that being played out in her life. And she ultimately then went away to divinity school and then came back gratefully for now. We'll see what God does next. And I think we're still, she and I still have these long conversations about like, what is God doing? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know all that he has in store for her. I just know that God's put a calling in her life to ministry and to the local church. And she loves the local church. She's probably well bent for an academic world, but she's kind of torn because she loves the church and she loves evangelism, and she likes where that the academy meets so anyway.
You talked about her as more mature than you and Tammy were when you were 23. I think she's more mature than most of us are at 57.
Yeah, she's an old soul. Yeah. I mean, and if she's listening to that, Brittany, I mean that in the best sense. She's 20,
yeah, right.
But yeah, I think she has there's a seriousness to her call. And here's what I would say: when we began to add a woman's, and not just hers, other women's voice into our church from our stage, speaking and praying, it was sort of like when you add an instrument into an orchestra and you didn't know it was missing, but all of a sudden the music sounds better, like it was created. It's like a bass guitar. You take out the bass, you don't actually know, but when you add it back in, you're like, dang, that sounds good. Why does it sound good all of a sudden? Oh, the bass guitarist was gone last weekend, he's back, right? So I think you're hearing like there's a voice, a woman's voice. And I do think men and women are different. And I think that it brings something that's powerful to the church. And it's blessed our place, and I think it's increased our ability to reach people. So
well, and I appreciated you going through the process, because it wasn't, hey, my daughter wants to be a pastor, so I'm going to change my view. And it's not, I see good works even, and I'm going to change my view. I remember you being very intentional going through it, even though other folks may land someplace else, but being very intentional about what does this verse mean in the context in which we're seeing it, and coming to a conclusion that was different than a tradition that you'd grown up in.
Yeah, we spent literally years, studying and waiting. And I think there's something to like letting something develop. It took me years on the Bible version thing. I just think that, God's not calling us to rush into these things, but to, this is a separate thing, but I think too, it gave our church a chance to give witness and to grow into this, as well as to see what God was doing. Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit. What's something you see? What's something cool you see God doing, or have seen God do recently that would folks get energized and excited when we hear these things? What's an example from Cape Cod Church?
Well, I'll give you one story. We were talking about this before, so we talked about Britt a bit, so this one kind of alludes to her too. We've been online, and 80% of our engagement is online right now. We have in-person services, but they're relatively small. And when Britt went away to divinity school, one of her roommates, she went to St. Andrews in Scotland, and one of her roommates was a Chinese student working on a PhD in economics, and they got to know each other. And Britt actually ended up joining a church that she thought gave her the best opportunity to invite her roommates who weren't divinity college students, that they might go with her. And she ended up with one roommate who was in the divinity school and two who weren't. And went with her a few times, and had actually already been in a Bible study and was reading. And then Britt left school. They kept in touch. She went back to China because of COVID, and reached out to Britt and started like following Cape Cod Church online, like was going. And so there's like a 11 or 12 hour difference, time zone difference. So like at 9 o'clock in the morning, it's like 9 o'clock at night or something like that for her. So she's on, and you know how Facebook like designates a top fan. She's become one of our top fans online, and she's not a believer yet, right? She's kind of like, she's in that journey. And she actually just joined a starting point class, which is a group for people who are just asking questions that meets every Friday. I think it's Thursday or Friday. My details, I should have gotten that right. But she actually was with this group and they celebrated Chinese New Year together, her from China and this group, and they're all meeting online. Nobody's in person. One of our pastoral staff leads the group, and they're just exploring and asking questions about faith. And so excited. I just see that as one of these great opportunities that this moment has given us.
How cool. Because overall, I think we can say, we all agree, COVID stinks.
Yeah.
But it's opened doors to ministry like this that we would have never thought were even possible, let alone that we'd have spent time and effort to get to, right?
Oh, how amazing. I just love seeing, and she gave us permission to share her story, and we shared it this past Sunday, which is one of the reasons it's kind of on my mind. We've got a women's recovery house that used to send 3 or 4 people to be in our services, and now because of COVID, they actually have a church service going on every Sunday where they all gather together and they watch the services together. And, and we're sharing this with us, and we're just like, wow, God, look at some of the stuff you're doing. Pretty cool.
You always say, hey, look, we're not a multi-campus church. You may have to start revising that.
Yeah, we had a discussion about that because we're actually getting ready to start something on Nantucket. And I told our staff in a meeting earlier, I said, listen, I'm the last guy that wants to start a campus. I've never dreamed of being the king of campuses. I just felt like, God, you're going to have to push me. But, in this moment, we see these pockets and they're just like, hey, could we do something? And we don't know exactly what that looks like. We're just like, okay, God, if you put something right there, we'll be faithful to it in that moment. And we want to serve and reach people wherever we can. Yeah.
Well, in the last 2 minutes, let me run through some lightning round questions.
Okay. All right.
These are for our audience. These are just quick questions, short answers. Favorite Bible verse?
Yeah, I want to give you a spiritual one like John 10:10. I'm coming to have life and life more abundantly. But I think if I'm being honest, James chapter 4, verses 1 through 10 is a powerfully convicting passage. And here's verse 10, I love. We bow down before him, admit our dependence on him. He'll lift us up and give us glory. That's in the old NLT. But it's the first one. It says, the first verse is, where do all the wars and fightings come from? They come from within you. You want what you don't have. So you kill and fight and deceive to get it. And I'm like, that verse just always convicts me. Like, Ben, where's this tension coming from? It's in you. You want something you don't have. So
that's a great point. And not only do we deceive other people about wanting, we deceive ourselves sometimes too, right?
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And so, hero in the Bible.
Yeah, I'm never good at these. I'm teaching through Jesus in the letters right now. So I'm in Paul, going through Paul's letter. So I'm going to say Paul for right now, but I'll be to James pretty quick and he'll become my favorite. And Jude, I'll get to John eventually. So yeah.
You can do worse than any one of those guys, frankly. Yeah. And so, hero not in the Bible.
I don't have one. You told me about this question earlier. I'm like, I really don't have like a hero. In fact, I think in our era where it feels like all of our heroes are failing and falling around us, I'm like, it feels like a scary time to have heroes. I'll give you one, and I mean this genuinely. My wife, like the unsung hero behind the scenes like this, but man, if somebody sees something worthy or desirable in our kids or in our church, it probably traces itself back to her humility and her closeness with Christ. So there you go.
She's phenomenal, and she knows how to bake a cake too. She's an artist, and it comes through in her baking. So what book are you reading now?
So I just finished a night ago A Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight. Oh my goodness.
Tove?
Yeah, Tov, which is the Hebrew word for good.
Okay.
And Scott McKnight is a theologian out of Northern Seminary, and he wrote it with his daughter. Her name is Laura, and she was a member of Willow Creek. So in part, it's a look at some of the painful tragedy that happened at Willow. But it more than that is a look at how do we get beyond the celebrity culture of church and pastor and get to a service culture. I would tell anybody reading the book, stick with it, because chapter 11, especially for my pastor friends, is pure gold. It's pure gold. And it really is a look. It says, listen, what is it? I mean, because we all have to be heartbroken about the scandals we're seeing in churches and among pastors and church leaders. And how do we get back to what God has called us to and what he's called the church to do? So it's really good in that way. And if people are wrestling, I'll give you a second one. A small book, 100 pages, called Creative Minority by John Tyson, who pastors in New York City. Really, really good. He wrote it right after the 2016 elections. It's more applicable today. Yeah.
Okay. Favorite movie?
No, favorite movie. I love Gladiator. There's something about that revenge scene. My name is Maximus Decimus Aurelius, and I will get my revenge in this life or the next. That probably is revealing a bit of my pugilistic side, but nonetheless, I have the poster in my basement man room. So,
and last one, favorite song?
Favorite songs that have to. Oh,
I know you played the Beach Boys yesterday.
We did play a Beach Boys song. I love worship music. I love some of the contemporary music. There's a new song out called Rattle, which is basically the Old Testament prophecy of dry bones coming back to life. And we had been looking at that song a year ago, and we were getting ready for it. And then we closed down, and I told Al, Al's our worship pastor, I saved that for Easter. Easter, we're going to sing it on Easter when the church is back together. Remember the 14-day close down?
Yeah, right.
And then I'm like, I said, save that song. We're not singing that one till we're back in the house. So we're saving Rattle by Elevation Worship for when we come back together. There's probably
when the whole church can be in a full building and touch each other.
I don't know when that's going to be. We don't have to be covered up in masks, but
yeah.
For now it's what we should do. But when it's not, boy, I can't wait for that.
Amen. Amen. Well, Ben, thanks so much for being with us today. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate your ministry. I appreciate your partnership. I love working together, but appreciate you coming on and sharing so much today. I think folks will be blessed by it and encouraged by it, and maybe think about some things differently about how they think about evangelism or things like that. And so thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank Bob Atherton, our producer, and thank our listeners. Who I'd ask to be praying for Ben and praying for Cape Cod Church and how he wants you to use what you heard from Ben today. And so thanks again, Ben.
Thanks, Charles. And thanks to you and everyone at Vision New England. We love the work you're doing, and the church in New England is better for it. So keep up the great work.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Our next episode is February 25th. We're going to do something a little bit different. It feels like every episode I say we're going to do something a little bit different. And this one we'll have on Dr. Ray Hammond and Pastor Enoch Lau. And we'll be talking about some contemporary news events from a biblical perspective. And we're probably going to show that we can disagree and still be in fellowship with each other, still respect each other, still love each other, and show that some of these issues aren't as simple as the world wants us to believe, and that probably contributes to the polarization when we forget just how complex some of them are. So that's going to be a new experiment we're going to try. So Ben, thanks again, and for listeners, see you then.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.